It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday evening. Lynn, a young black woman, had just finished a long shift and stopped by the supermarket to pick up a few essentials. Exhausted but relieved to be almost done for the day, she parked her car, stepped out, and was immediately met with a sharp, angry shout. That parking spot was mine! Standing in front of her was a middle-aged white man, his face red with anger, his eyes glaring with a hostility she couldn't ignore. He had emerged from a large SUV, storming toward her with an unmistakable sense of entitlement. Lynn took a steadying breath and tried to stay calm, speaking politely, "I'm sorry, I didn't see anyone waiting here." But her words only seemed to fuel his fury. "You people are always like this, always doing whatever you want without any regard for others," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain she'd heard too many times before. This time, though, it pierced deeper. She stood there, feeling the humiliation sink in, the anger rising in her. It was as if her very presence was an offense to him. Lynn wanted to walk away, avoid the confrontation entirely, but he stepped closer, blocking her path, his gaze turning from angry to menacing. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" His voice was thick with threat, and before she knew it, his hand shot out, striking her across the face. The slap rang out sharply, and the sting of it burned deep into her pride. Lynn stood there, frozen for a moment, the pain radiating from her cheek, feeling the weight of every cruel word he had spat at her. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, some people filming with their phones. But instead of feeling afraid or helpless, Lynn felt something else, a surge of courage, an unshakable determination to not let this man get away with it. Without a second thought, she retaliated, delivering a firm slap back. The man's face shifted from smugness to shock as he stumbled backward, clutching his cheek, disbelief flooding his expression. "How dare you hit me? Who do you think you are?" he seethed, his voice a blend of outrage and vulnerability. But Lynn didn't flinch. She stood tall, looking him straight in the eye, no longer willing to let her dignity be trampled. The crowd looked on in stunned admiration, while the man's face twisted with rage and disbelief. Lynn didn't stop there. She took out her phone and called the police, her voice trembling slightly but unwavering. She reported the assault and the damage he'd done to her car, pointing him out to the arriving officers as he stood nearby, mumbling angrily under his breath. As the police questioned both of them, the man tried to twist the story, claiming that Lynn had attacked him first and that he was only defending himself. His brazen lie left everyone stunned, but Lynn held her ground, silently watching his desperate attempt to play the victim. The tension hung thick in the air, leaving the onlookers wondering, would justice be served? Or would this man's deceit and privilege once again shield him from the consequences of his actions? As Lynn stood her ground, the crowd murmured, exchanging glances of shock and admiration. The police took her statement, and she carefully recounted every detail of the encounter. How she'd parked, how he'd screamed at her, the slap, and how she'd only defended herself. The officers listened, their expressions turning serious as they processed her account. Then they turned to the man. But rather than a shred of remorse, he wore a smug, triumphant look, confident that his version of events would shield him. Suddenly, he shifted to playing the victim, raising his voice so that everyone in the crowd could hear. "She assaulted me first. I only reacted to defend myself." His words rang out, but Lynn remained composed, silently watching his desperate performance. The officers raised their eyebrows but said nothing, taking notes as they observed his dramatic gestures. A few people in the crowd rolled their eyes. Some even laughed quietly, unimpressed with his act. But Lynn's heart pounded as she wondered, would they believe him? Could his lies really get him off the hook? Just as doubt began to creep in, a voice emerged from the back of the crowd. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, holding up her phone. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice firm and clear. "I recorded the whole thing." The air shifted. Lynn glanced at the woman, a wave of relief washing over her. The man's face paled as the officers turned their attention to the woman's video. She pressed play, and on the screen, the entire confrontation unfolded. The man's aggression, his insults, the slap, and Lynn's restrained response. The truth was right there, undeniable, for everyone to see. The officers watched closely, their expressions hardening as they witnessed the man's hateful actions. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in the video as Lynn's courage and dignity shone through. And when the video ended, the silence was thick. The lead officer turned to the man, his voice low and steady. "Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back." The man's face contorted with rage. "You're arresting me? For what? She's the one who hit me. You're all crazy," he shouted, his voice rising in anger as he resisted, twisting in the officer's grasp. But there was no escaping now. The officers handcuffed him, his protests falling on deaf ears as he was led to the squad car. Lynn watched, feeling a surge of relief, but also a lingering sadness. The truth had come out. Yes, and justice was being served, but the ugliness of the encounter had left scars she couldn't ignore. An officer approached Lynn, speaking in a tone that was calm yet reassuring. "We'll make sure this is handled properly, ma'am. Thank you for staying strong and speaking up. Do you want to file a formal complaint?" Lynn nodded firmly, her voice steady. "Yes, I'm going to see this through. He can't get away with this." And as the squad car pulled away with the man inside, Lynn felt a new strength rising within her. She had done something today she hadn't expected to do. She'd stood up, she'd fought back, and she'd proven her worth. But as she walked back to her car, she noticed something that sent a fresh wave of frustration through her. Deep scratches etched along the side of her car, a spiteful reminder of the man's hatred. She gripped her phone, feeling her frustration bubble up again. Shaking her head, Lynn took a breath, trying to calm her racing heart. This was far from over. She'd see this fight through to the end, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt marginalized, insulted, or treated as less than. As Lynn looked at the ugly scratches on her car, her anger simmered. This wasn't just damage to her property. It was an attempt to hurt her pride, to leave a mark that reminded her of the hate she'd faced. But rather than let it sink her spirit, it only strengthened her resolve. She was done letting people like him think they could walk all over her, done letting them think their actions had no consequences. With a deep breath, she got in her car and drove to the police station, determined to file her complaint and leave no detail unspoken. As she waited, replaying the incident in her mind, an officer approached her with a sympathetic look, gently guiding her into a quiet room. Lynn sat down across from him, feeling the weight of her day pressing down, but she was determined to stay strong. The officer looked her in the eyes, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me everything that happened, every word, every action. We're going to make sure this is handled correctly." Lynn took a deep breath and began recounting everything in detail. The man's initial outburst, his racist remarks, the slap, and her decision to defend herself. She described his mocking expression after damaging her car, the disdain he held as if she didn't deserve basic respect. As she spoke, her voice trembled slightly, but her determination kept her steady. The officer listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally glancing up with empathy and understanding. Then he asked, "Do you remember if anyone else was nearby who might have seen or recorded the incident?" Lynn thought hard, picturing the chaotic scene. She remembered the woman who had shown the video, and even a few bystanders who had been holding up their phones. "Yes," she nodded. "I think there were a few people who might have filmed it, and the supermarket might have security cameras that caught the incident too." The officer's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "That could be very useful," he said. "We'll check with the supermarket management to see if they have any footage. It might take some time, but if there's anything, it'll back up your account." Lynn nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. She knew this process would take time, but it was a step forward. She left the station with a sense of resolution, knowing she'd done everything in her power to make sure her story was told and her dignity protected. Days passed, and the anxiety of waiting gnawed at her. She couldn't help but worry. Would the evidence be enough? What if his lies twisted things against her? But she held on her faith that justice would prevail. And then, one morning, her phone rang. It was the officer from the station, sounding energized. "We've got the footage, Lynn. It shows the whole thing. His aggressive approach, his words, the slap, and your restraint. It's all there." A wave of relief washed over her, bringing tears to her eyes. Finally, her side of the story would be undeniable. She thanked the officer, her voice choked with emotion, knowing that this was the validation she needed. The day of the trial arrived, and Lynn felt a mix of nerves and strength as she entered the courtroom. The man, Mr. Johnson, as she learned his name, sat across the room, his face a mask of indifference. But she noticed his eyes darting nervously around the room, no longer carrying the smug arrogance he'd shown before. Lynn's lawyer, a confident young woman named Sarah, stood up to deliver the opening statement. With clarity and passion, Sarah recounted Mr. Johnson's actions, his racism, and his attempts to intimidate Lynn. She pointed out how he had tried to diminish Lynn's dignity, not only with his words but with his actions. Every word was a hammer of truth, and Lynn felt a surge of gratitude for having someone so fiercely on her side. When it was Mr. Johnson's turn, his lawyer tried a different approach, portraying him as a man under pressure, a family man, a father who'd simply had a bad day. They argued that it was an impulsive reaction, nothing more. But when the video evidence played on the courtroom screen, showing his approach, his words, his slap, and Lynn's calm response, the room fell silent. Even the jury members looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they watched his aggression and her steady resolve. The silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of truth. And in that moment, Lynn felt a surge of strength, knowing that her story had been heard in full. After the video ended, Lynn took the stand. She described the incident with poise and courage, speaking of the humiliation, the anger, and her resolve to not let people like Mr. Johnson control her life or her worth. Her voice trembled at moments, but her resolve only strengthened as she continued. And as she finished, the room was quiet, every eye on her, every ear hanging on her last words. When she stepped down, Lynn felt a calmness settle over her. She had spoken her truth. She had shown her strength. As Lynn took her seat after giving her testimony, she glanced around the courtroom, feeling the weight of every eye on her. She'd poured her heart out, shared her story with courage, but there was still a sense of vulnerability, a quiet fear of the unknown outcome. The prosecution wrapped up its case, and it was now the defense's turn to argue. Mr. Johnson's lawyer, a seasoned attorney with a calm, polished demeanor, approached the jury with a smile that seemed almost too composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "We all have bad days, don't we? Days when stress clouds our judgment, when we act in ways we regret." His words were gentle, carefully chosen, aiming to portray Mr. Johnson as a relatable, sympathetic figure. Lynn's heart sank a little as the lawyer continued, painting Mr. Johnson as an overworked, misunderstood man who had simply lost his temper. The attorney subtly suggested that Lynn had overreacted, that maybe she had misinterpreted his frustration as something more sinister. Lynn watched, her fists clenched under the table, as he crafted a careful web of excuses, hoping to sway the jury into believing this was just a misunderstanding. But then, Sarah, her own lawyer, stood up. Her face was calm, but her eyes fierce, as if she could see right through every word the defense had said. "If it were truly a bad day or a moment of stress, ladies and gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong, "would it lead to a slap? Would it lead to racial slurs? Would it lead to damaging someone's car?" She let the questions hang in the air, each one landing like a small explosion, dismantling the defense's carefully woven narrative. With a subtle nod from the judge, Sarah presented the security footage again. This time, she slowed down certain parts, highlighting the mocking, sneering expression on Mr. Johnson's face as he spat his hateful words, the aggressive body language, and the smug satisfaction after the slap. Each frame was a vivid reminder of his true nature. The jury watched, some of them visibly disturbed, and even the defense lawyer's confident facade began to crack. Mr. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting away from the screen, as if he couldn't bear to watch his own actions. And then, just when Lynn thought she had endured the worst, a new witness was called, someone who took the courtroom by surprise. A young woman, clearly nervous, entered the room. She wore a slight, sad smile as she looked over at Lynn, then turned to the judge and quietly introduced herself as a former colleague of Mr. Johnson. "I worked with him for a few years," she began, her voice barely a whisper, but gaining strength with each word. "And I couldn't stay silent anymore. This behavior you're seeing, it wasn't a one-time thing." The courtroom went completely silent. Lynn's eyes widened, and she could feel the atmosphere shift, a tension that was both thick and charged with anticipation. "He has a history of treating people like this," the woman continued, her voice growing more confident. "Especially women, and especially those who don't look like him. I saw it happen more times than I can count, but I was always too afraid to speak up." She glanced over at Lynn, and a look of shared understanding passed between them. Sarah seized the moment. "Thank you for your courage in coming forward," she said softly, her gaze steady on the young woman. Turning to the jury, she added, "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't about a bad day or momentary stress. This is about a pattern of behavior, a sense of entitlement and superiority that people like Mr. Johnson carry, unchecked and unchallenged. Until today." The defense lawyer fidgeted uncomfortably, struggling to regain control, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The jury exchanged glances, some nodding, as if they were beginning to see through the lies and excuses. Lynn's heart beat faster. She felt a surge of relief, a sense of validation not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel small. She wasn't just standing up for her own dignity. She was standing up for so many others. The judge announced a short recess, giving everyone a moment to collect themselves before the final arguments. Lynn stepped outside the courtroom, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the past few days lifting ever so slightly. She looked around, seeing her lawyer and a few supporters by her side, and for the first time, she felt a sense of real hope. But just as she was beginning to let her guard down, she noticed Mr. Johnson standing across the hall, flanked by his lawyer. He glared at her, his face contorted with rage, and she could sense the venom in his eyes. He mouthed something under his breath, a silent threat, promising retaliation. Lynn felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to look away. Instead, she met his gaze with unwavering determination. He might have tried to break her spirit, to make her doubt her worth, but he hadn't succeeded, and he never would. When she returned to the courtroom, she sat taller, feeling her strength renewed. Whatever happened next, she was ready to face it. She was no longer the silent bystander, no longer willing to shrink in fear. She was a fighter, and this was only the beginning. As the final arguments began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Lynn sat quietly, hands clasped tightly together, her heart pounding. The defense lawyer made one last attempt to paint Mr. Johnson as a misunderstood man, caught in a moment of frustration. He recited Mr. Johnson's community work, his role as a father, his supposedly exemplary character. But each word seemed emptier than the last, falling flat in the room that had already seen the truth for itself. When Sarah stood up for her closing statement, her voice was clear, and her words carried the weight of justice and truth. She reminded the jury of the video evidence, the testimony of Mr. Johnson's former colleague, and Lynn's own courage in coming forward. This case isn't just about one man's anger or a bad day. It's about something much deeper, a refusal to acknowledge the humanity and dignity of another person simply because of the color of her skin, Sarah said, her gaze fixed on the jury, her words filled with quiet fury. No one should be made to feel less than human. No one should endure the hate and aggression that Lynn experienced that day. And today, you have the power to stand up and say, enough. The jury members sat still, absorbing her words, the gravity of the moment settling over them. Lynn could see a few of them nod, others exchanging glances of understanding. She felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, justice was within reach. The judge called for the jury to deliberate, and Lynn was led to a quiet room to wait. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second stretching endlessly as she sat with Sarah, her hands shaking slightly. She tried to breathe, tried to calm her racing mind, but the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her. Sarah reached over, giving her a reassuring smile. You've been so strong, Lynn. No matter what happens, you did the right thing. Lynn managed a small smile, grateful for Sarah's support, but a storm of emotions still churned inside her. She thought about every moment of the encounter, every word, every look, the pain and humiliation she'd felt, and the strength she had found to push through it all. After what felt like hours, the door opened, and an officer beckoned them back to the courtroom. Lynn's heart raced as she took her seat, her eyes fixed on the judge as the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. The judge asked the foreperson to stand, and Lynn held her breath, her entire world narrowing to this one moment. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mr. Johnson, guilty of assault and property damage. Lynn exhaled sharply, a flood of relief washing over her. The weight she'd been carrying seemed to lift, replaced by a powerful sense of vindication. Around her, she heard murmurs of approval, people nodding in agreement, others whispering words of support. But Lynn hardly noticed. She was lost in her own quiet victory, a feeling of justice finally served. Mr. Johnson's face turned a sickly shade, his once defiant expression crumbling as the reality of the verdict set in. For the first time, Lynn saw a hint of vulnerability in him, a flicker of fear in his eyes as he realized he was truly accountable for his actions. But just as she thought this chapter had closed, he stood up, turning to glare at her one last time. His voice was low, barely audible, but filled with venom. "This isn't over. I'll make sure you regret this." Lynn felt a shiver run down her spine, but she steadied herself. She looked him squarely in the eye, unafraid. "No," she replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "It's over for you." With that, Mr. Johnson was escorted out of the courtroom, and as he disappeared from view, Lynn felt a calmness settle over her. She had won, not just the case, but a battle for her dignity, her right to exist freely without fear or shame. She'd spoken up, she'd stood her ground, and she'd come out stronger on the other side. As she left the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer, the air fresher. She knew this journey wasn't completely over. There would be further steps, possibly even appeals. But she had taken the first, most difficult step, and she'd done it with courage. Walking down the courthouse steps, she paused, closing her eyes for a moment and letting the sun wash over her. She knew there were many others like her, facing injustices in silence, afraid to speak up. And for the first time, Lynn felt a calling, a purpose. She knew she wanted to help others find their voices too, to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had. The fight for a fairer, more compassionate world had only just begun, and Lynn was ready to lead the way. As Lynn left the courthouse, she felt an unexpected surge of energy, a powerful sense of purpose brewing within her. She had won today, yes, but the road ahead was still uncertain. She knew that her victory was just a single spark in a world filled with countless untold stories of injustice. If she could stand up against someone like Mr. Johnson, maybe she could help others do the same. Over the next few weeks, Lynn found herself at the center of a growing movement. News of her trial spread, and people reached out to her. Strangers who'd seen the footage, friends who had endured similar injustices, even community leaders who admired her bravery. Her story became a rallying point, a reminder that no one should have to endure the hate, discrimination, and indignity she had faced. One day, Lynn was invited to speak at a local event. She hadn't considered public speaking before, but there was a fire inside her, a need to use her voice for something greater. As she took the stage, looking out at the crowd of faces, she felt both nervous and empowered. She took a deep breath and began. "I never thought I'd be here," she said, her voice strong yet filled with emotion. "But I realized that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for others too. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and it's only by speaking out, by refusing to be silent, that we can make a real change." The crowd erupted into applause, and Lynn felt a rush of gratitude, a connection to the people around her that she hadn't expected. They weren't just applauding her. They were affirming a shared commitment to justice, to unity, to the idea that no one should be treated as less than human. After the event, a young woman approached her, eyes wide with admiration and a bit of shyness. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly. I've been through something similar, and I always thought, well, I thought no one would understand. But seeing you, hearing your story, it makes me believe I can be strong too. Lynn smiled, moved by the girl's words. In that moment, she understood the true power of her journey. It wasn't just about her. It was about creating a ripple effect, empowering others to stand tall, to fight for their own dignity and the dignity of others. She reached out, giving the young woman a reassuring hug, a silent promise that she wasn't alone. Days turned into weeks, and Lynn continued to find herself at the heart of this wave of change. She joined nonprofits, spoke at schools and community centers, and became a vocal advocate for racial equality and justice. Every story she heard fueled her determination. Every person she met reminded her that the fight was worth it. Then one day, Lynn received a letter. It was from Mr. Johnson. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was short, written in a jagged, almost angry scrawl. I'll never forgive you for what you did to me. You made a fool of me, and I'll never forget it. Lynn read the words, feeling a wave of old anger bubble up, but then something surprising happened. She realized she didn't feel fear or resentment anymore, only pity. Mr. Johnson was still shackled by his own hate, unable to see past his own bitterness. And in that moment, Lynn understood just how far she had come. She folded the letter calmly, deciding to keep it as a reminder, not of the pain she'd endured, but of the strength she'd gained. She placed it in a box alongside other mementos from her journey, a small collection that symbolized her transformation. As Lynn looked out her window, she thought of the future, of the people she would continue to meet, the lives she would help uplift. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she was ready. One evening, as Lynn was preparing to give another speech, her phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a message from an unknown number. At first, she hesitated, memories of Mr. Johnson's bitter letter flashing in her mind. But something urged her to open it. Hello, Ms. Lynn. You don't know me, but my name is Rachel Johnson. I'm Mr. Johnson's daughter. I wanted to thank you for everything you did. You showed me what strength and resilience really look like. I grew up in a house filled with the same anger and bitterness you faced in court. But watching you stand up to my father gave me the courage to step away and find my own path. I'm finally free, and I have you to thank for that. Lynn sat down, stunned. She read the message again, her heart swelling with an indescribable mix of emotions. She had never considered that her journey might impact Mr. Johnson's own family, let alone inspire someone so close to him to break free from his toxic influence. Rachel's message was like a mirror, showing Lynn how her battle for justice had radiated outward, touching lives she'd never even met. She replied with a heartfelt message of support, letting Rachel know that she was not alone, that her own journey was just beginning, and that it would be worth it. Over the following months, Lynn and Rachel exchanged messages, forming an unlikely bond rooted in shared experiences of strength and resilience. Lynn became a mentor of sorts to Rachel, helping her navigate the complexities of building a life free from the shadows of anger and prejudice. They even began meeting regularly, often over coffee or at quiet parks where Rachel felt safe enough to share her own story. One afternoon, as they walked along a trail, Rachel stopped and looked at Lynn, her eyes filled with gratitude. You know, meeting you has been the best thing to come out of all this, she said quietly. You didn't just help me find my strength. You helped me see that there's a different way to live. I want to be part of this fight too. I want to help others find the courage to stand up, just like you did. Lynn smiled, her heart warmed by the young woman's words. You already are, she replied, placing a hand on Rachel's shoulder. Every time you speak your truth, every time you choose kindness over bitterness, you're helping build the world we all want to live in. They stood there for a moment, letting the peace of that realization sink in. Lynn saw in Rachel a reflection of herself, someone who had endured hardship but had found a way to turn pain into purpose. It was in that moment that Lynn knew she was no longer alone in her mission. She had an ally, a friend, and someone who would carry forward the same message of resilience and justice. Soon, they began working together, joining community organizations, attending events, and speaking on panels. Lynn's story had started as one woman's fight for justice, but now it was growing into a movement, one built on empathy, solidarity, and the strength of shared experience. Rachel was right there beside her, speaking out, helping others, and giving voice to those who felt silenced. At one of their events, a young girl approached Lynn and Rachel, her eyes wide with awe. "You both are so brave," she said shyly. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Rachel knelt down, looking the girl in the eyes. "You already are brave," she said warmly. "You have a voice, just like we do. And every time you use it to stand up for what's right, you're changing the world." Lynn watched, moved by the exchange, feeling a quiet pride in how far both she and Rachel had come. What had started as a painful confrontation with hatred had blossomed into a journey of healing, empowerment, and inspiration. As they walked away from the event, Rachel turned to Lynn. "Thank you, Lynn, for everything." Lynn smiled, her heart full. "We're just getting started." Months went by, and Lynn and Rachel's work continued to grow. Their message resonated far and wide, drawing people of all ages and backgrounds. They were invited to conferences, workshops, and even local government meetings to speak on topics of justice, compassion, and the power of standing up. Together, they became symbols of resilience. A woman who had faced hatred and prejudice, and a young woman who had chosen a path of healing and understanding. But one day, as they were wrapping up a community event, a familiar figure appeared in the crowd, watching them from a distance. Lynn's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him, Mr. Johnson. He stood on the edge of the crowd, his face shadowed, an expression unreadable. For a moment, Lynn felt the old, familiar tension, the memory of his cruelty resurfacing. She instinctively took a step closer to Rachel, both of them sensing his presence. He approached them slowly, his steps hesitant. The crowd seemed to fall silent as he came nearer, sensing the weight of this unexpected encounter. Mr. Johnson looked at Lynn, his face showing something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability, perhaps even remorse. There was a moment of silence as they stood facing each other, and for the first time, Lynn saw the man without the armor of anger and prejudice. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I know I've caused pain, to you, to my own daughter. I don't know if I can change. But seeing you two, seeing how you've both grown, it's made me think." He paused, struggling for words. "Maybe I was wrong." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. Lynn felt a wave of conflicting emotions. She glanced at Rachel, who was watching her father with a mix of shock and guarded hope. It was clear that this moment was just as profound for her. Taking a steadying breath, Lynn replied, "It's not about whether I forgive you. It's about what you choose to do now. You have the power to be different, to make things right for yourself and others." Rachel took a step forward, her voice soft but steady. "Dad, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to try, to be the father you never were." Mr. Johnson looked down, his face a mixture of pain and realization. "I'll try," he whispered, barely audible. As he turned to walk away, Lynn and Rachel exchanged a glance, knowing that this small moment didn't erase the past, but that it planted a seed of change. They continued their work, carrying with them a sense of closure, a belief that even those steeped in bitterness could choose a different path, if only they were willing to try. In the weeks that followed, Lynn and Rachel continued to inspire those around them. But now there was a new layer of depth to their mission. They weren't just fighting against hate. They were planting seeds of hope, even in the most unexpected places. And in doing so, they found that their own hearts healed a little more each day, knowing they had turned their pain into a force for good in the world. As Lynn and Rachel continued their journey, they found their lives taking an unexpected turn. One day, Lynn received a call from a national news network that had heard of her story. They wanted her and Rachel to come on air and share their journey, hoping to inspire a wider audience. The invitation felt surreal, but Lynn knew this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. She called Rachel immediately, and together, they prepared to share their message on a national stage. On the day of the interview, Lynn felt a mix of excitement and nerves. As they entered the studio, bright lights and bustling staff surrounded them. Rachel reached over, giving Lynn's hand a reassuring squeeze. "We're here for something bigger than ourselves," she whispered, and Lynn nodded, finding strength in her friend's words. When the interview began, the host introduced their story with a brief clip of their past, footage of Lynn's courtroom victory and scenes from the community events they had led together. The host turned to them with an encouraging smile. "Lynn, Rachel, thank you for joining us. Your story has touched so many, and we'd love to hear what drives you both to keep fighting for change." Lynn took a deep breath, her voice steady. "For me, it's about making sure no one has to feel what I felt. It's about creating a world where people don't have to fight to be seen as equals, where dignity is a given, not something you have to demand." Her words were simple but powerful, echoing the strength she had found through her journey. Rachel chimed in, her voice filled with emotion. "I grew up in a home where anger and hate were normal, and I thought that was just the way life was. But meeting Lynn, seeing her strength, it changed me. Now, I want to be part of a world where kindness, understanding, and justice are the norm." The host nodded, visibly moved by their words. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "But let me ask, how do you stay hopeful, especially with all the challenges out there?" Lynn smiled, a lightness in her expression. "We stay hopeful because we're not alone. Every day, we meet people who want the same things we do. And with each new person who joins us, the load feels a little lighter." The audience applauded, and after the interview ended, Lynn and Rachel were flooded with messages from viewers, each one expressing admiration, gratitude, or sharing their own experiences with prejudice and resilience. Lynn felt a renewed energy. She could sense a growing wave of people ready to join their cause. In the days that followed, support poured in from all over. Lynn and Rachel found themselves invited to speak at events and forums across the country, sharing their story in schools, universities, and even corporate seminars. People wanted to listen, to learn, to be part of something that mattered. They were building more than just a movement. They were building a community of people dedicated to love, respect, and justice. One evening, after an event, Lynn and Rachel sat together in a quiet cafe, reflecting on how far they had come. Lynn looked at Rachel with a smile. "If you had told me a year ago that we'd be here, that we'd be doing all of this, I wouldn't have believed it." Rachel laughed, her eyes shining. "Me neither, but I'm so glad we are." Lynn nodded, her heart full. They were not only changing the lives of others, they were transforming their own. As Lynn and Rachel's impact continued to grow, they were invited to attend a global summit on justice and equality, a prestigious event bringing together activists, leaders, and changemakers from around the world. They were both overwhelmed and honored by the invitation, realizing that their journey, once a personal fight, had blossomed into a global call for change. When they arrived at the summit, the atmosphere was electric, filled with people eager to exchange ideas and share experiences. Lynn and Rachel found themselves among influential figures, yet they never felt out of place. They belonged here, alongside people who understood the depth of their fight and the resilience it took to face each day. On the day of their talk, the auditorium was packed. The room fell silent as Lynn took the stage, her heart racing with both excitement and responsibility. She glanced at Rachel, who gave her an encouraging nod. This was a moment they had both prepared for, yet it felt surreal to stand before a crowd this large. Lynn began, her voice calm but powerful. "When I first started this journey, I never imagined it would lead here. I was just a woman who had been hurt, who had faced prejudice and cruelty. But I learned that our stories have power, that the smallest act of courage can spark a fire." The crowd was mesmerized, hanging on every word. Lynn spoke of her pain, her battles, and the strength she found in speaking up. She shared the importance of community and how Rachel's courage to break free from a toxic environment had only fueled her own determination to continue fighting. Rachel then took the microphone, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Growing up, I was afraid of my own voice. I thought silence was safer. But meeting Lynn showed me that speaking up doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. It gives others the courage to find their voices too." She paused, looking over the sea of faces, feeling the weight of the words she was about to say. To anyone who has ever been afraid to speak up, to anyone who has been told their story doesn't matter, you do matter. And together, we can create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and respected. The crowd erupted in applause, many standing in admiration, some visibly moved to tears. The impact of their words resonated far beyond the walls of that auditorium, a ripple of strength and hope spreading to countless others. After the summit, Lynn and Rachel received messages from people worldwide, sharing stories of resilience and solidarity. They were invited to collaborate on international projects, each opportunity expanding their reach and deepening their purpose. They had become symbols of strength, their voices a beacon of hope for those who had once felt voiceless. One night, as they reflected on their journey together, Rachel turned to Lynn with a smile. "We've changed lives, haven't we?" Lynn nodded, her heart full. "Yes, and I think we're just getting started." As Lynn and Rachel continued their journey, they found themselves delving even deeper into the work of advocacy and change. Their influence began to touch the lives of people in ways they hadn't imagined. One afternoon, they received a message from a woman in a small town who had been inspired by their story to stand up against discrimination in her workplace. She wrote about how, for the first time, she felt powerful and unafraid. Reading this, Lynn felt a deep swell of emotion. She turned to Rachel, who was equally moved. "We're making a real difference," Lynn whispered, almost in disbelief. "People are finding their strength because of us." But their journey was far from easy. As they gained more visibility, they also faced resistance. Some people questioned their motives, others accused them of stirring up unnecessary conflict. And, on occasion, they received threatening messages from those who wanted them to stop. These messages were laced with hate, shadows of the same prejudice they had been fighting against. At times, it felt like each step forward came with a pull backward, testing their resolve. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Lynn felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She sat alone, looking out her window, feeling a rare moment of doubt. Was she strong enough to continue this path? Was all this sacrifice worth it? Rachel, sensing Lynn's mood, walked in and quietly sat beside her. She placed a hand on Lynn's shoulder. "Hey," she said softly, "you taught me to keep going even when it's hard. Remember? You've been my rock all this time, and I'm here to remind you, you are stronger than you think." Lynn looked at her, grateful tears in her eyes. She felt the strength return, reignited by Rachel's unwavering belief in her. They sat in silence, the quiet solidarity between them reminding Lynn of the purpose they had built together, a mission bigger than any challenge they would face. And as they continued, they found strength not just in each other, but in the countless voices joining their cause. Community members began to organize events of their own, inviting Lynn and Rachel to speak and share their insights. Soon, they were creating workshops, training sessions, and community dialogues focused on understanding, empathy, and justice. One day, as they wrapped up a workshop, a young man approached them hesitantly. I just wanted to say thank you," he stammered. "I come from a family where prejudice was normal. I never questioned it until I heard your story. It changed me. I want to be different. I want to make things right." Lynn and Rachel exchanged a look, both deeply moved. Lynn placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "Change starts with awareness, and you've already taken the first step. Keep going. You're on the right path." Their mission had become a wave, a movement driven not by anger, but by compassion, courage, and the willingness to change. And as each new person joined, they felt the power of their purpose grow stronger, knowing that this journey would continue beyond them, spreading further than they'd ever dreamed possible. As their movement gained momentum, Lynn and Rachel's work began to attract attention from international human rights organizations. One day, they received an invitation to a prestigious awards ceremony where they would be honored for their contributions to equality and social justice. The event was to be held in a grand hall filled with people from around the world, all gathered to celebrate those who had dared to stand against injustice. When the evening of the ceremony arrived, Lynn and Rachel felt both humbled and overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all. They walked into the hall, dazzled by the chandeliers, the elegant crowd, and the energy of the night. They had never dreamed they'd be standing among global activists, celebrated for the same fight that had once felt so personal and isolating. As they took their seats, Lynn turned to Rachel, her eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. "I still can't believe we're here," she whispered, and Rachel squeezed her hand, sharing her awe. This moment wasn't just about them. It was about every person who had been inspired by their journey, everyone who had found the courage to speak up, to challenge the status quo. When their names were called, they stood together, walking to the stage amid thunderous applause. The room was filled with people from different countries, different backgrounds, all united by a common belief in human dignity and respect. Lynn stepped forward to the podium, her heart pounding, and began her speech. "I'm honored to be here," she began, her voice strong but emotional. "This journey started from a single moment of pain and injustice, but it has transformed into something much greater. This isn't just my story or Rachel's story. It's the story of every person who has ever felt unheard, unseen, or unworthy. And it's proof that when we stand together, change isn't just possible, it's unstoppable." Rachel spoke next, her voice filled with conviction. "Growing up, I didn't know what hope looked like. But Lynn showed me, and she taught me that one person's courage can light a path for others. Together, we're creating a world where everyone has a place, where voices once silenced can finally be heard. And tonight, standing here with all of you, I know that our work has only just begun." As they finished, the room erupted in applause, the audience giving them a standing ovation. The applause wasn't just for Lynn and Rachel, but for the movement they had created, a testament to resilience, compassion, and the courage to believe in a better world. After the ceremony, people from all walks of life approached them, some with tears in their eyes, others with words of admiration and encouragement. Leaders from various countries expressed interest in collaborating, inviting Lynn and Rachel to bring their message to their communities. The opportunities seemed endless, and the possibilities filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. Late that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the hall was quiet, Lynn and Rachel sat together, looking out over the city lights. They reflected on how far they had come and the countless lives they had touched. And though the road ahead was still long, they knew they were ready. As they looked out into the night, Lynn felt a quiet certainty settle over her. They were no longer just two women fighting for justice. They were a beacon for others, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could always be found. And with Rachel by her side, Lynn knew they would continue to make a difference, one voice, one life, and one act of courage at a time. As the weeks passed after the awards ceremony, Lynn and Rachel found their lives filled with new possibilities and challenges. Invitations poured in from countries they'd never dreamed of visiting, each one offering a new stage to amplify their message of resilience and justice. But as their influence grew, so did the weight of the responsibility they felt. They were no longer just two women fighting for themselves. They were now representatives of a global movement, carrying the hopes and struggles of people they had never met. One day, they were invited to speak at a gathering of young activists in a remote village, far from the spotlight of the large cities they'd recently visited. The village had struggled with deep-rooted inequalities, and the people were eager for change, but wary of outsiders. Lynn and Rachel accepted the invitation without hesitation, feeling that these were the very people they wanted to reach most, the ones who had been silenced for too long, just as they once had been. When they arrived, they were greeted by a modest crowd of villagers, young and old, who looked at them with a mix of curiosity and hope. Lynn took in the simple surroundings, the open sky above them, and felt an unexpected sense of peace. This wasn't a grand hall or a crowded conference room. It was a place where stories were shared not for applause, but for the sake of connection. As Lynn began to speak, she noticed the young faces looking up at her, their expressions intense and full of longing. She spoke about her journey, the pain and challenges she had faced, and the moments of doubt that nearly held her back. She told them about finding her voice, about the courage that comes from standing up, even when it feels like the world is against you. Rachel then shared her story of transformation, the bravery it took to break away from a past filled with prejudice and find her own path. Her voice was steady, but her words were filled with raw honesty. "Change doesn't come easily," she said, looking directly into the eyes of the young people in front of her. "But it's possible, and it starts with each of us deciding that we deserve better." After their speeches, the crowd fell silent, and for a moment, Lynn and Rachel wondered if their message had truly reached these people. Then, an elderly woman stepped forward, her face lined with years of hardship, but her eyes filled with gratitude. She held Lynn's hand tightly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've given us hope," the woman whispered, her eyes misty. "You've reminded us that even in this small village, our voices matter. Thank you for coming here. We won't forget your words." The young people gathered around, each one eager to share their own dreams and stories, each one looking to Lynn and Rachel for guidance. They listened to the stories of struggle, of dreams deferred but not forgotten. They stayed well into the night, talking, laughing, and finding strength in the simple act of sharing. As Lynn and Rachel left the village, they felt a profound shift within themselves. The glamour of the awards and the international stage felt far away, replaced by something much deeper, a connection to the people they were fighting for, a reminder of why they had started this journey in the first place. And as they drove away under the stars, they knew that their mission was more than just changing laws or gaining recognition. It was about reaching people in forgotten places, about giving voice to those who had long been silenced, and about creating a legacy of hope that would ripple far beyond their own lives. Together, they had become more than advocates. They had become a bridge between worlds, a beacon of light in even the most distant corners. And they felt ready, now more than ever, to continue this journey, wherever it might lead. Months passed, and Lynn and Rachel continued to travel from city to village, connecting with people who were eager for change. Their impact had grown beyond what they'd imagined, and yet each person they met, each story they heard, only deepened their commitment to this path. But despite their success, there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, times when they wondered if they were truly making a lasting difference. One evening, after a long day of speaking engagements, they returned to their hotel room exhausted. Lynn sat by the window, gazing at the city lights, a quiet uncertainty shadowing her expression. Rachel noticed, and after a moment's hesitation, she joined Lynn, sitting beside her with a gentle smile. "Thinking about everything, aren't you?" Rachel asked, her voice soft yet knowing. Lynn nodded. "Sometimes I wonder, are we really changing anything? Or are we just temporary voices in a world that moves on too quickly?" Rachel was quiet for a moment, then reached for her phone. "I want to show you something," she said, pulling up a video. It was footage from one of their recent village visits, where a young girl stood in front of a group, passionately speaking about the change she wanted to see in her community. Her voice was filled with conviction, her eyes shining with a fire Lynn recognized all too well. "I recorded this without you knowing," Rachel admitted, a hint of laughter in her voice. "This girl told me afterward that she's speaking up because she saw you do it first. She said you showed her that courage is possible, even when it feels like you're standing alone." Lynn watched the video, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. The young girl's determination, her strength, it was a reflection of everything Lynn and Rachel had hoped to inspire. In that moment, the doubt melted away, replaced by a deep sense of purpose. "You're right," Lynn whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's not about the big crowds or the awards. It's about moments like these, isn't it? It's about giving people the strength to believe in themselves." Rachel smiled, squeezing Lynn's hand. "Exactly. And as long as we keep doing that, we're making a difference. Even if the world moves on, even if some people forget, these lives will remember." The next morning, they set out again, their spirits renewed. They traveled to a small, impoverished town where they held a workshop for women who had long felt voiceless and powerless. They taught them the power of their stories, showed them how to organize, and encouraged them to support one another. As the workshop ended, an elderly woman approached them, her voice shaking with emotion. "You've given us hope," she said, clutching Lynn's hand tightly. "We thought the world had forgotten us, but you reminded us that we matter." Lynn and Rachel left that town with their hearts full, knowing that every step they took, every story they shared, was helping to create a web of resilience and courage that stretched far beyond themselves. And so they continued, village by village, town by town, spreading a message that was no longer just about justice and equality. It was about human connection, about lifting each other up, and about the quiet, powerful impact of love and empathy in a world that too often forgets its most vulnerable. They didn't know where this journey would lead them, but for the first time, they weren't focused on the destination. It was the journey itself that mattered, and they were ready to walk it together as long as there were people who needed them. As Lynn and Rachel continued their journey, they became more than just speakers. They became trusted allies, friends, and mentors to those they encountered. People sought them out not only for inspiration, but for guidance on how to stand up, how to organize, and how to create lasting change within their own communities. And with each encounter, Lynn and Rachel felt the movement they'd sparked take on a life of its own. One day, they received an invitation from a remote community deep in the mountains, a place that had been largely isolated from the rest of the world. The people there had heard about Lynn and Rachel's work and were eager to learn how to fight against the discrimination and marginalization they'd experienced for generations. Despite the challenging journey ahead, Lynn and Rachel knew they couldn't turn down the invitation. After hours of winding roads and rugged terrain, they arrived in a small village nestled among towering mountains. The villagers greeted them with a quiet reverence, their faces lined with the strength and resilience of lives spent enduring hardship. Children peeked out from behind their parents, and elders nodded in solemn gratitude. Lynn and Rachel could feel the weight of the moment, the hopes these people had placed in their arrival. They began by listening to the villagers' stories, accounts of being overlooked, treated as lesser, denied basic rights. Lynn and Rachel listened with open hearts, recognizing the pain and frustration, the all too familiar sense of being unseen. When it was finally their turn to speak, Lynn's voice was filled with empathy and determination. "You are not invisible," she told them, her voice strong yet tender. "Your lives, your voices, matter more than you know. Together, we can learn how to amplify them, how to make the world listen. It starts here, with each one of you believing in the power you already hold." Rachel stepped forward, addressing the younger villagers, who looked at her with admiration and curiosity. "Change doesn't come easy, but it's possible. You have the strength, and you have the right to demand respect and equality. We're here to show you the tools, but you're the ones who will lead the way." For the next few days, they worked with the villagers, conducting workshops on community organizing, storytelling, and standing up against injustice. They watched as the villagers grew more confident, voices once hesitant now brimming with conviction. Young and old alike began to share their ideas, their visions for a fairer future, their hopes for a community where every person was treated with dignity. On the final night of their stay, the villagers gathered around a fire under a clear, starlit sky. One by one, they shared their dreams for their community, the firelight reflecting in their eyes, ignited with a newfound sense of purpose. A young girl stood up and, with a shy but proud voice, spoke of her desire to become a leader, someone who could represent her people and advocate for their rights. Lynn and Rachel exchanged a glance, both deeply moved. This was the impact they had hoped to create, a spark that would continue to burn long after they were gone. As they prepared to leave the next morning, the villagers gathered to say goodbye, showering them with heartfelt words and small, handmade gifts. An elder approached them, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've given us more than hope," she said softly. "You've reminded us that we are not forgotten." Driving away, Lynn and Rachel looked back at the village nestled in the mountains, feeling a bittersweet sense of fulfillment. They knew that they had planted seeds of change, seeds that would grow and flourish in ways they could only imagine. And as they traveled on, their hearts carried a piece of that village with them, a reminder of the power of human connection, the courage to believe in something better, and the legacy of hope that now stretched further than they'd ever dreamed. As Lynn and Rachel continued on their journey, they began to realize the ripple effect of their work. Communities they had once visited reached out with updates, sharing stories of how their workshops had inspired new leaders, how people were standing up, creating support groups, and organizing for positive change. The seeds they had planted were now blossoming in ways they had never expected. One day, they received an invitation from a group of students at a large urban university asking Lynn and Rachel to speak about resilience and advocacy. These students had followed their journey from the beginning and had been moved by their work in rural and marginalized areas. They wanted to learn how they could apply the same principles to their urban environment, where social pressures and systemic issues were different but no less challenging. When Lynn and Rachel arrived at the university, they were greeted by a sea of eager faces. The energy was electric, and they felt a renewed sense of excitement at the prospect of inspiring the next generation. As they took the stage, Lynn felt a deep sense of responsibility, knowing that the lessons she and Rachel had learned could shape the paths of countless young people in the audience. Lynn began her speech with a story of her early struggles, the moments of doubt and isolation, the fear that speaking up would make no difference. She described the courage it took to face each challenge and the power she found in her own voice. Her words struck a chord with the students, many of whom were struggling to navigate their own battles in a fast-paced, often unforgiving world. Rachel followed, sharing her journey of transformation, how she had learned to overcome the prejudices she'd grown up around, to challenge her own beliefs, and to choose a path of empathy and change. "We all have the power to choose who we become," she told them. "And when you choose to stand up for what's right, you become part of something far bigger than yourself." The students were captivated, and as the Q&A session began, hands shot up across the room. Students asked how they could start movements in their own neighborhoods, how they could sustain their passion in the face of adversity, and how to stay true to their values in a world that often tries to dim them. One student asked, "How do you keep going when the challenges feel endless?" Lynn paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, and answered with a gentle but firm voice. "We remember why we started. Every person we've met, every story we've heard, reminds us that this isn't just about us. It's about giving people hope, about building a future where everyone feels seen and valued. And when we feel like giving up, we look back at all those who believed in us, and we keep going." After the event, students lingered, forming small groups to discuss ideas, share dreams, and exchange contact information. Lynn and Rachel watched, seeing the spark they had lit take hold in each of them. They felt a powerful sense of fulfillment, knowing they had passed on the torch to a new generation ready to continue the fight for justice and equality. As they left the university, Rachel turned to Lynn with a smile. "They're going to do incredible things. I can feel it." Lynn nodded, a sense of peace washing over her. "Yes, they are, and knowing that makes everything worth it." Together, they continued their journey, hearts full, knowing that the legacy of their work would live on in every person they had inspired, spreading far and wide, building a world shaped by compassion, resilience, and the courage to speak up. Not long after the university event, Lynn and Rachel found themselves facing one of their biggest challenges yet. They were invited to a town known for its deeply ingrained prejudices, where people were resistant to change and outsiders were often met with hostility. Many warned them against going, urging them to reconsider. But Lynn and Rachel had faced fear and doubt before. They knew that the places that needed change the most were often the hardest to reach. When they arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Some locals eyed them with suspicion, others with outright hostility. They could feel the weight of generations of unchallenged beliefs pressing down, a heaviness that hung in the air. But Lynn and Rachel refused to be deterred. They had come to listen, to understand, and to plant the seeds of empathy and openness, even if only a few were willing to receive it. Their first workshop had a small turnout. People were wary, silent, and defensive. Lynn and Rachel began by sharing stories, but the audience seemed unmoved, closed off. Frustration simmered beneath the surface, but they kept their composure, knowing that change couldn't be forced. One evening, as they prepared for their final workshop, a local teenager named Sam approached them. He looked down, shuffling his feet, clearly unsure of how to start. "I've heard what people are saying about you too," he muttered. "Some think you're wasting your time here. But I think what you're saying makes sense. I just don't know how to talk about it without people shutting me down." Rachel's face softened, and she gave Sam a gentle smile. It's hard to be the first to speak up, especially when others don't understand. But courage starts with one voice. And sometimes, all it takes is one person to start a ripple. Encouraged by her words, Sam agreed to attend the final workshop. This time, Lynn and Rachel began differently, inviting the group to share their own stories, struggles, and frustrations. Sam was the first to speak, his voice shaky but determined. He spoke about feeling trapped by the beliefs he'd grown up with, about wanting a different future for himself, but not knowing where to start. One by one, others began to open up, their words tentative at first, but growing in strength. People who had once been silent now found their voices, sharing stories of pain, fear, and longing for something better. The room shifted as walls came down, replaced by vulnerability and a newfound willingness to listen. By the end of the workshop, Lynn and Rachel had watched the town's residents transform from skeptics to allies, realizing they were not as alone in their hopes for change as they'd once believed. They left with hugs, handshakes, and promises from the people who had once doubted them. As they drove away, Lynn glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the town fade into the distance, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. "This is why we do this," she whispered. "For those moments when people finally see each other, truly see each other." Rachel smiled, nodding. "Every place we go, every person we meet, it's all part of the journey. And even if just one person changes, that's enough to start something real." Their hearts filled with hope, Lynn and Rachel continued forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that each step, no matter how small, was bringing them closer to the world they dreamed of creating. As Lynn and Rachel continued to travel, their journey took an unexpected turn. They were invited to a major international conference, a gathering of influential leaders, activists, and visionaries from across the globe. This was unlike any event they had attended before, a high-stakes environment where powerful voices would debate and shape the future of human rights and social equality. For the first time, Lynn and Rachel felt the weight of representing not only themselves but the thousands of people who had been impacted by their work. On the day of their presentation, the hall was packed with an audience of diverse backgrounds and beliefs, each person a key player in the ongoing fight for justice. Lynn and Rachel took the stage, feeling a mix of excitement and pressure. They knew this was their chance to reach people who had the power to influence policies, to reshape societies, and to amplify the work they had dedicated their lives to. Lynn began by sharing the story of their journey, of how a single moment of injustice had sparked a movement that had reached across borders and barriers. She spoke of the villages they had visited, the lives they had touched, and the transformations they had witnessed. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of countless stories, the quiet courage of the forgotten, the resilience of those who had once felt powerless. Rachel followed, her voice filled with conviction. She spoke of the young people they had met, the new leaders they had inspired, and the communities that had begun to rise up, demanding the respect and dignity they deserved. She described their vision of a world where everyone's voice could be heard, where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. "We're not just speaking for ourselves," she told the audience. "We're here for everyone who has ever felt invisible, silenced, or afraid to dream." As they finished, the hall was silent for a moment, the audience visibly moved. Then, one by one, people began to rise, applauding with a fervor that echoed through the entire space. Lynn and Rachel stood there, taking it all in, feeling the energy and support of a global community that understood their mission and believed in their vision. After the presentation, leaders and activists approached them, some with tears in their eyes, expressing their admiration and commitment to supporting their cause. Representatives from various countries invited them to collaborate, to bring their message to new places and empower people who had long been marginalized. Late that night, Lynn and Rachel sat together, reflecting on the enormity of what they had experienced. They felt a sense of awe, not only for how far they had come, but for how many people had joined them on this journey. The world felt smaller, more connected, and they knew they were no longer alone in their fight. As they looked out over the city lights, Rachel turned to Lynn, her eyes bright with possibility. "We're part of something much bigger than ourselves," she said softly. "It's like every person we've met, every story we've heard, has woven itself into a tapestry that keeps growing." Lynn nodded, a quiet determination settling within her. "And we're going to keep adding to it every single day." With renewed purpose, they prepared to take their next steps, knowing that their mission had become a movement, a living, breathing testament to the power of empathy, resilience, and the courage to envision a better world. Together, they would keep moving forward, building bridges across divides, and lighting a path for others to follow. The journey was far from over, and they were ready to continue, one voice, one story, and one step at a time. After the international conference, Lynn and Rachel's influence continued to spread, their message reaching corners of the world they had never anticipated. But with their growing visibility, they faced increasing challenges. Critics emerged, some accusing them of disrupting traditional values, others arguing that their work was overly idealistic and impossible to achieve. At times, the criticism was sharp and unrelenting, testing their resolve in ways they hadn't experienced before. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and media inquiries, Lynn found herself feeling worn down, questioning whether their work could truly stand against so much opposition. Rachel noticed her friend's fatigue and suggested they take a walk to clear their minds. They strolled through a quiet park, the night air cool and calming, stars scattered above them. As they walked in silence, a young woman approached them shyly. She introduced herself as Mia, a college student who had followed their journey from the beginning. Mia's voice trembled as she expressed her gratitude, explaining how their courage had inspired her to challenge her own community's prejudices and to form a support group for young people seeking change. "I don't think I would have ever believed in myself if it weren't for you too," Mia said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me that one voice can make a difference, and that even when people don't understand, it's still worth it." Lynn looked at Rachel, seeing her own feelings reflected in her friend's eyes. In that moment, Mia's words washed away the doubts, reminding them of why they had started this journey. They thanked Mia, feeling their spirits renewed by the knowledge that their work was having an impact, even in ways they couldn't always see. As they continued walking, Lynn felt a surge of strength. She turned to Rachel with a small smile, her resolve rekindled. "It's not about silencing every critic or proving everyone wrong. It's about reaching those who need it most, like Mia. If we can help even one person find their voice, then it's all worth it." Rachel nodded, her eyes shining with shared determination. "Exactly. And for every person like Mia, there are countless others waiting for someone to show them that change is possible." In the weeks that followed, they continued their work with renewed passion, undeterred by the obstacles. They returned to some of the communities they had visited before, reconnecting with people who had become part of their movement. In each place, they found new stories of resilience and transformation, evidence that their work was planting seeds that were taking root and flourishing. At one of their workshops, a group of children ran up to them, holding handmade posters decorated with colorful drawings and words of encouragement. One poster read, "Thank you for showing us how to be brave." Another simply said, "Hope." Lynn and Rachel exchanged a look, both overwhelmed by the children's sincerity. Here, in these simple, heartfelt gestures, they found a reminder that their mission was about more than speeches or headlines. It was about nurturing hope in the hearts of those who had almost given up, about creating a world where courage and kindness could thrive, even in the smallest acts. As they looked at the children's faces, full of innocence and possibility, Lynn knew that their journey was only just beginning. With every step forward, they were building a foundation of compassion and empowerment that would live on in future generations. Together, they pressed on, prepared to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that as long as they kept moving forward, they were never truly alone. In the weeks following their last workshop, Lynn and Rachel's movement began to grow faster than they could have ever anticipated. Social media was flooded with testimonials from people across the world sharing how their lives had been impacted. Their names became synonymous with courage and change, and soon, even more influential organizations and individuals began to reach out, eager to support their mission. But with this new wave of recognition came something they hadn't foreseen. One evening, as they prepared for another event, Lynn received a mysterious envelope with no return address. Inside was a single note, written in bold, unfamiliar handwriting. Asterisk, you're disrupting something much bigger than you realize. Walk away while you still can. Asterisk, Lynn felt a chill run down her spine as she showed the note to Rachel. They both knew that they had made powerful allies, but it seemed they had also drawn the attention of forces that wanted to silence them. Undeterred, they pressed on, determined not to let fear dictate their path. But as the threats continued, they realized they might be uncovering layers of resistance far deeper than they'd imagined. At their next event, a shadowy figure appeared in the back of the crowd, watching intently before slipping away. Rachel caught a glimpse of the figure's face just before they vanished, leaving her shaken but resolute. "We're getting closer to something important," she whispered to Lynn. "Whatever's behind this, they're scared of the change we're making." Undeterred, they continued their work. But now every moment was tinged with suspense, the feeling that they were on the verge of exposing something much bigger than they had anticipated. As more people rallied behind them, the stakes grew higher, and whispers of a hidden opposition reached their ears, a shadowy network intent on preserving the status quo at any cost. Their journey had become more than just a fight for justice. It was now a mission to unveil the truth, a truth that some would stop at nothing to bury. Standing before a massive crowd at their next event, Lynn addressed the audience, her voice filled with unshakable resolve. "We started this journey hoping to inspire change, but now we see that there's something much larger at play, a world of hidden forces that want to keep us quiet. But we won't back down." The crowd erupted in applause, their support an electrifying force. Rachel stepped up beside Lynn, her gaze fierce. "What we're fighting for is too important to stop now. And for all of you standing with us, know this." She paused, letting the anticipation build, then said, "This is only the beginning." Asterisk, if you're as inspired as we are, share your thoughts in the comments below. Spread this message to your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay with us on this journey. Together, we'll uncover the truth and keep fighting for a better world. Asterisk.